Sorry. Thank you, Colin, for reminding me to record this. This is a recorded session, so it'll be posted on our YouTube channel, which is linked on casitocoalition.org. So we received our first grant from CZI. We're really excited about that, which is going to help us do things more effectively, including great sessions like this and hire staff, etc. So we're really thankful and grateful for their support. I also want to thank our premier sponsor / members, AARP, Berry Council. We are the sponsors supporting the Casito Coalition, CBIA, the California Builders Association, the California Community Builders, Grace Star Development. So thank you all for your generous support. And then two more quick things. Two more quick things, sorry. In terms of membership, we just launched our membership drive. So we are completely understanding of the situation of the serious public health crisis going on right now. We did just launch our membership efforts, reaching out to our coalition participants to contribute if possible, if feasible. But for this year, we are honoring a membership through the rest of 2020, given the circumstances. So if you are a passionate volunteer at Casito Coalition, please continue to do so. And hopefully next year, you'll have the opportunity to financially support the Casito Coalition. But if you are able and willing, it would really help us advance our efforts moving forward. And then finally, I'm gonna, before I hand it over to Colin, please be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A portion. You could also use the chat as well, but we'll hold off the Q&A until both speakers do their presentations, and then we'll go ahead and have a larger Q&A for everyone. All right, great. And with that, I'll hand over to Colin.
Great. Thank you, Xiomara. Let's see if I can get to the first slide. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to walk through a presentation about homeowners associations as it relates to land use and housing regulations and policy. So backing up for a second for some context. So in the United States, there's about 350,000 community interest associations, which represents something like 23% of people in the United States of these different types of community interest associations you see listed here. So 74 million people, quite a few. And so bringing it back to California, there's 200 plus state agencies. There's 58 local agency formation commissions at each of the counties, which we'll talk about a little bit more in one of the future slides. There's 471 cities. And believe it or not, there are 48,000 HOAs in California alone. And control something like 25% of the existing housing throughout California, and 35% of Californians live in an HOA. There was a study within the last year or two from Clarke and Friedman, no relation to me, that showed that 60 to 80% of new construction is in an HOA. So from a public policy perspective, it is something interesting and worth talking about. And also for context, there's HOA dues just in California alone of $22 billion per year. So why did we start analyzing HOAs? So we want to help quantify the affordable housing capacity in existing neighborhoods. And so you may be aware of the McKinsey report from 2016 that says that California needs 3.5 million homes by 2025. And so the UCLA Lewis Center looked at the zoning capacity and found that there was a shortfall against that. And so in part, the result was potential loosened of regulations, which many of you are aware of as it relates to ADUs. So what I did was I partnered with UCLA to see if we could add the HOA layer to that study. And so asking the question of where are HOAs located, because it's actually not really geospatially known or mapped in any large way by a public agency. And so how many HOAs have regulatory barriers, if any, and which types? Are HOAs willing to be partners for development when it comes to housing? And we'll talk about that a little bit later as to why HOAs would be a good partner. Regulatory changes may or may not be needed, and so that's something that could also come out of this effort. So bringing it to LA County, you can see, sorry, there's 15,000 HOAs just in that county alone, and there's 500,000 homes needed by 2025. And so similar number, but more than that, can accommodate an ADU in the garage or backyard, and 91% of the garages are underutilized and used for storage. So there's a lot of potential here. So another reason why it's in our interest to analyze HOAs is because in Maricopa County, Arizona, for example, and which may be the case depending on the research that we find in California, is that the CC&Rs, the codes, covenants, and restrictions, are in California by law required to be public documents at the county assessor's office. And so in Maricopa County, there was a study done over several decades that showed that increasingly, and now at this point, 67% of these architecture and landscaping rules documents are finding themselves privately held. And so in California, what that may mean, and which I have seen in some cases, and not necessarily that there's any sort of bad intention there, it actually gives the HOA more flexibility to update the design review procedures and process, but as a referral from the CC&R document. So it's actually not a public document. So what I'm realizing is that it's in the public interest at a grander scale when it relates to housing policy and regulations. So, and for the reason that these private businesses do govern issues that are at this point a statewide concern when it comes to the housing declared state emergency per SB 330 that became law on January 1st. So some HOAs do have restrictions beyond city and county regulations, and the government, local or otherwise, may or may not be aware of that. And so, for example, some HOAs require an entire parcel or an entire unit to be rented, which may prevent a new ADU. I'll be curious to hear from the group. Maybe AB 670 may address this to some extent, but that may be up for debate. So feel free to leave questions and comments in the chat, and our moderators can field those after our presentations, and I look forward to the discussion. Another piece of context is that 17.5 million renters, almost half of Californians. And so when it comes to state legislation that just became effective, 670 is the one that I mentioned. Basically, that's the one that says, and I have to say a huge thank you to the Casita Coalition and all of you for the collaboration on this bill in particular, for example, because basically what it says is that HOAs cannot outright ban ADUs. They can have reasonable restrictions, but not as it relates to banning the construction or the use of an ADU. And so 68 included the multifamily zoning. If HOAs already have a CC&R rule that bans all rentals or limits some rentals, I'm not necessarily clear as to whether or not 670 would allow an ADU, and so that's something to think about. And when it comes to defining reasonable restrictions, there's prefab bans potentially, adjacent neighbor notification minimum open space requirements, height restrictions, and view protection requirements that HOAs may already have or may soon adopt. And so the question is, potentially debatable as to whether or not that's considered reasonable or not. And it may be interesting to see what happens during the implementation of this law. But if those requirements that I just mentioned are implemented by the HOA, and then it becomes more expensive to build the ADU where the HOA prefers, would that be considered unreasonable? So 671 is the one I want to mention as it relates to the requirement for cities and counties to include ADUs in their housing element updates. Santa Clarita is the only one so far that I'm aware of that does know its geospatial boundaries of HOAs. So I'm happy to hear from others if you do know of other cities and counties that have that data. And so in terms of LAFCOs, their role is mandated from the state, and they discourage urban sprawl and encourage orderly formation and development of local agencies, which perhaps could be interpreted to include HOAs. And because it doesn't necessarily specify cities and counties and water districts, for example. And factors that must be considered in those spheres of influence are the present and planned land uses and the existence of any social or economic communities of interest in the area. So LAFCOs do have the authority to study governmental agencies, and the reason I've highlighted this word here is in the hopes that perhaps there could be an interpretation that given that HOAs are businesses, but they are governmental in nature, perhaps they can be partners in the research of HOAs as it relates to housing policy because of these other state-mandated roles that I've mentioned. And so another piece of state legislation was 330 that I mentioned, declared the state emergency. It bans cities and counties. It does not reference whether or not HOAs can enact new rules. 670 helps address that. But it may not address everything as it relates to housing in general. So 881, for example, does shorten the approval timeline to 60 days, but it doesn't mention anything about HOAs. And so theoretically, HOAs could have a non-concurrent review process for the design, and they could lengthen it. But then you could make the argument that 670 may cover that to some extent. So I couldn't resist making reference to the champions for ADUs that contribute to the Casita Coalition and making a joke about monthly dues with HOAs. But in seriousness with the coronavirus response, we see some of the public policy issues when it relates to HOAs, because 35% of Californians are living in HOAs, and theoretically, if many of these are losing their jobs or losing hours and wages, they still have to pay monthly dues. And so the California governor's executive orders do mention protections for homeowners and limiting evictions, but I have not yet seen anything as it relates to specifically to HOAs. So for as little as a penny or dollars, under 1% of the home value, theoretically the HOAs could put a lien on a home, and this could become a much bigger issue. And the example below is in Tennessee. There was a letter sent to 25 homeowners that have been working from home given the coronavirus public health crisis. And so they were threatened with liens, foreclosure, and eviction. So definitely worth talking about this HOA issue at a statewide public policy level. So when it came to partnering with UCLA, UCLA distributed the survey earlier this year. There was 450 responses from LA County, and 200 of those responses were from HOAs. So emphasizing that these are preliminary findings, the respondents were more likely to report a willingness to add ADUs if they had incentives rather than without. That may not be surprising to many of you. However, one thing that may be surprising is that men are found to be potentially more likely than women to express willingness to build an ADU. So that's something that warrants a bit more digging into the data and researching to figure out why that might be, but it's just a preliminary finding from our partners at UCLA. And I do want to give a shout out to Yamilet, who has been an amazing partner, and Kelly Turner, also the professor who's been sponsoring this initiative. So big thanks to all of them and others at UCLA and otherwise in volunteering with this research. The next thing I'll mention is that respondents that do live in HOAs are more likely to express willingness to build ADUs, but they're also more likely to express concern that either the board or their neighbors may disapprove of that. Now, this survey was given in January, February timeframe after the new laws became effective, and we tried to socialize some of those new laws, but there's still a lot of awareness to be had in terms of the new legislation. The most common barriers that have been found in terms of preliminary findings are cost, which again is probably not a surprise to many of you, space or the lack thereof, and property values being the next, and then HOAs coming in second to last, and crime coming in last in terms of the most common ones. In terms of the most common facilitators for why people would want to build ADUs, financial assistance and shorter entitlement process. And I know many of you have been working on this for a very long time, and you do know that. And so next steps, what do we need to do? So another big shout out to one of the board members, Darren Ranaletti, and the City of Oakland and everyone else who's emphasizing the importance of protecting existing housing that is affordable and ADUs that are naturally affordable, not necessarily subsidized housing. And so that warrants us looking at our existing neighborhoods. So in terms of this HOA research, looking at potentially new funding opportunities, because so far the UCLA research, we've focused on LA County, but we hope to be able to scale up to all 58 counties in California, and could certainly use help doing that. And so there's volunteers. If you would like to help, it'd be great. Doing public record requests, for example, for codes, covenants, and restrictions that are at each county's assessor's office. And also, I'll show this in a later slide, but I also met with the Contra Costa County LAFCO, and so people who want to do that in other counties are welcome to, and I'm happy to work with them. Having some GIS support would be great for mapping the HOAs, and then partnering with HOAs who could be a really great development partner for housing opportunities, many of whom I've learned from talking with a number of people who have provided legal counsel for decades to HOAs, thousands of HOAs throughout California, is that they have deferred maintenance, and their structures and other infrastructure are coming at life cycle 50 to 70 years old, for example. They have low cash reserves because maybe at the local level it's hard to convince people that it's a good idea to raise monthly dues, for example, and underfunded liabilities, things like roof replacement. It would be great to have a sponsor from the Senate or the Assembly for new legislation. We've had great people that we've worked with thus far. Senator Bob Wachowski from Fremont, and Assembly Member Laura Friedman from Orange County. Big thank you to them and their staffs. And so here, in a later slide, I'll have a hyperlink, and you all will have access to these slides, and you can use the hyperlinks to comment on draft legislative ideas. Definitely open to more input. It's also worth noting that in Arizona and in Florida, there's 2 bills this year for HOA reform that I'd be curious to see how they fare in other states, and if California wants to do something similar here. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be helpful in California. So 670, for example, if by the nature of HOAs being treated as businesses under the Davis-Sterling Act, state law, they do have the right to ban rentals altogether, not just short-term rentals, but long-term rentals. And so in order to represent the rental community, which represents 44% of Californians, this might be something worth looking at. And also looking at HOAs, carports, for example, as potential ADU type opportunities. But because they're not associated with an individual parcel and individual principal dwelling, they wouldn't qualify as an ADU. So perhaps the regulations could be revised to encourage that type of development. And if someone were going to do an ADU or other housing, wouldn't it be nice to have more streamlined sale and transfer of PUD, planned unit development land, perhaps at fair market value, but also maybe with some financial incentives in terms of a reduced price or property taxes for 5 years. There's a number of really good efforts that you all are hearing about through the coalition, including those that allow for a landlord, for example, to agree to offer housing to Section 8 vouchers or other people of lower incomes that need homes. And if you're willing as a homeowner to agree to that for the first 5 years, then they can help with the financing or even the funding as well. So the thought here with the sale and transfer of HOA land is that it would be small in size, underutilized, like dead landscaping, but it may have common infrastructure below ground that needs to be considered, from the HOA standpoint and perhaps from the water district and others. So a question is, should a small number of homeowners be required to gather enough funds to perform government functions like repaving a street? I've met people that have much smaller HOAs that aren't hundreds or thousands of units in size. And so if 3 or 5 homeowners need to try to cobble together, no pun intended, enough money to repave a street, is that the role of this, moving forward in the long run? Especially if it gets deferred for decades and becomes a safety issue or an emergency access issue when it relates to the fire department or the police department. And also thinking about other infrastructure that is worth considering at the HOA level. So there are some basic democratic things that could be great to have from the HOAs in terms of, for example, when it comes to design review of ADUs, in some cases there are unelected non-board members that are nice enough to volunteer their time to review designs, but if they have project approval and authority and a vote, they may be unelected. So is that something that we as a society want? That's a good public policy question. Looking at also, due process from HOAs, their ability to foreclose on small liens, should that be limited? And meeting minutes, something as simple as this, because it's a private organization, that's treated as a business, but there is a public interest there as it relates to housing policy. So the renter representation I mentioned earlier, HOAs also have the ability to limit or ban non-resident landlords from serving on the board. So because renters are also banned from attending meetings, HOAs inherently, in some cases, can entirely ban the entire perspective of renters. So I think that's something worthy of public debate. I'm open to question and comments later, and we can talk about more resources. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Colin. Yes, you're doing such great work for the Casito Coalition. I know you've been very much in the weeds with this, with our fantastic intern Yamilet, with the UCLA public policy center, and I really appreciate all that you're doing. And we have some really great questions coming in, so we'll definitely get to those when we get to the Q&A portion. And now let's transition to Callie. So we just heard about HOAs and LA County. Let's talk about a little bit more about all the great work City of LA has done when it comes to ADUs more comprehensively. So with that, I'll let you kick off the presentation.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen share set up. But yeah, I'm excited to talk to you all today about some of the impact that we've seen here in LA with regard to a lot of the recent changes to state ADU law in terms of what we've seen in terms of implementation, as well as our kind of response through our adoption of our local ordinance and what that process has looked like for us here in LA. So just to kind of reiterate, I work in the planning department here in Los Angeles on a citywide team that works on long-range housing policy. So that included working on drafting our ADU ordinance, but also helping with a lot of the implementation issues as we've kind of been rolling out and reacting to a lot of the changes. So sort of starting with kind of our pre-2017 history of what we were kind of seeing in terms of ADU activity here in LA. So we actually first adopted our first ADU ordinance back in 1985, and that, I think, probably like a lot of other jurisdictions, required a discretionary review through a conditional use permit, and had a number of sort of standards built in that made it very difficult for a lot of people to build an ADU on their property. There was sort of a first round of changes to state law back in 2001 that required us to have a ministerial process. So that CUP kind of went away, but we still had things like minimum lot sizes in our local ordinance and sort of other size regulations around the ADUs. So in 2010, we actually issued a zoning administrator memo that effectively kind of tossed out our entire ADU ordinance. So we were not applying those kind of minimum lot size requirements or really anything that was in that section of our code, but we did have other zoning standards in place that still made it very difficult for the majority of properties to build an ADU on their property, or for the majority of homeowners to build an ADU on their property. For instance, we have like a passageway requirement that requires a certain vertical clearance up to the sky between buildings. And so just kind of like looking at a lot of the lots in LA, it just wasn't physically feasible to build something that complied with our other zoning standards. And then we actually had a lawsuit brought against that memo, that ZA memo, and just kind of a lot of activity happening in 2016. So all of that just to say that ADUs were kind of very legally dubious here in LA, as well as difficult given all of our regulations prior to 2017. And as everyone knows, there were some pretty significant changes in 2017 to require all cities to not only provide for a buy rate approval process, but to also ensure that they're complying with certain mandatory state standards. Our ordinance, as I mentioned, did neither of those things. So all of our regulations were null and void, and we really were just in, state implementation mode. I think like many other cities across the state, we just started implementing those state standards, and we actually saw a huge increase here in LA. I think probably we kind of led the state in terms of ADU production with a huge increase in ADU permits. So you can see on this chart, as I mentioned before, 2017, we had very, very little permit activity for ADUs. And then starting in 2017, we saw a big jump in the number of applications, and actually to date, so this is based on year-end numbers from last year. We had a total of over 14,000 ADU applications had been submitted to the city. 11,000 had been issued permits, and then another about 4,500 had been issued a certificate of occupancy, so had gone to completion. And the majority of those really are the alteration type. So that's, basically the conversions of existing structures. And while we don't have a great breakdown on how many of those were legalizations of existing ADUs, we do suspect that a good chunk were ones that had maybe already been existing, but were able to come in and be legalized under the new standards. I also wanted to share sort of a geographic breakdown of ADUs. So this is by our community plan areas. It's really our geographic boundaries that we use to do a lot of our land use planning here in Los Angeles. And so the darker areas are where we're seeing a higher count of ADUs. I think the kind of main takeaways from this map is we're really seeing it pretty much everywhere throughout the city. The areas that are grayed out are downtown, which doesn't have single family zoning, our airport and our port. So really, you know, we're seeing it distributed throughout the city. I think the other thing to note is there is more of a concentration in the valley, but I think it's actually become more evened out than it was before we began the new state standards, whereas before a lot of I think it was like 95% of our ADUs were in the San Fernando Valley, because those are usually our larger single family lots. So I'll quickly kind of talk through, since we started implementing the state standards, we were also working on developing our local ADU ordinance. We started this actually back in 2016 when I mentioned there was kind of a flurry of activity, and we started work on it in anticipation of the state law changing in 2017. But we actually did not get to adoption until this past December 2019. So as we were moving through that process, there were a number of issues that were kind of rising to the fore that I'll go into in a little more detail. But for the main part, our ordinance does incorporate all of the state ADU standards. And what we actually did is the new things that were introduced in 2019, we incorporated by reference. So we just cite to those code sections because we had actually gotten all the way through our planning commission actually twice, and then back up to the planning committee of our city council, and when the state law changes were passed last fall. So we're trying to kind of move quickly and incorporate those new kind of forthcoming standards. So it just kind of points to the government code sections. And then some of the other kind of local provisions that we incorporated, we did some things around movable tiny houses. I'll explain a little more. And we also introduced a limitation in our hillside and very high fire hazard severity zones, and then a couple of other tweaks. So some of those key differences, I mentioned that hillside very high fire hazard severity zone restriction. We also did some provisions that were really coming from an interest to kind of allow for the additional housing capacity, but respect the kind of built form of a lot of our residential neighborhoods. And so there was a restriction in placing the ADU in the front yard. And that, I should say, is for new construction. There's also a smaller restriction on kind of expanding your driveway in the front yard. And then a provision that deals with the notion of someone maybe converting, if they had a smaller main home, converting the entire thing to an ADU and then building a larger home in the back. We also added some new allowances, so the movable tiny houses, as well as the removal of a building distancing requirement that we had in our zoning code that was not necessarily addressed by the state standards, as well as some other kind of miscellaneous provisions around like requirements to build a wall around your driveway if you're providing required parking in your driveway. So a little more detail on that hillside restriction. And this was really, this is what we spent most of our time actually going back and forth with our decision makers here in LA, was how to treat our sort of environmentally sensitive areas. These are areas that are basically everywhere that is within a very high fire hazard severity zone. Environmentally sensitive areas here in the city, there was concern around introducing additional housing capacity here. And we were really trying to strike the right balance of understanding how we could mitigate those concerns while still allowing the additional ADU and housing capacity. So where we landed is there's no new construction of ADUs allowed in the areas where there's an overlap with our hillside regulations and our very high fire hazard severity zone. So it's actually all of the areas that are shaded on that map. unless the property has a 20-foot paved roadway in front of the lot. There's a fire sprinkler provided for the ADU, and 1 parking space is provided on site. And kind of the important thing to note is that this only applies to the new construction, obviously, and does not apply to any of the conversions that would come in under the exception section of the state law. And then kind of the other notable difference that we introduced from the state law was to allow movable tiny houses as a detached ADU. And this was actually linking to the state definition of a park trailer, and basically stating that you could use these types of vehicles as a residential unit on your property. And the way that it works is that the movable tiny house has to receive state certification according to one of 2 standards. So it's actually something that our building department does not even check anything to do with the structure. And they're generally, you're looking at, something that's between 150 square feet, so that's like a minimum size for a dwelling unit, up to a maximum of 430 square feet. We do require utility connections for these at this point. And we also introduced a sort of set of limited design standards to make sure that you're having like a residential typology. I'll go through a little bit more detail on implementation. I know we're running out of time, but I'll just point out that we issued a memo this winter that really, so we incorporated reference to the new state law changes, but there were a lot of challenges with regard to interpretation and what all of these new kind of provisions around the multifamily, the junior ADU, how do you combine different types of ADUs on a property, really just a lot of very specific implementation questions that came up. And we actually issued this jointly with our Department of Building and Safety, which is a department that actually is implementing all of this. And so one of the kind of key things that we tackled was creating a guide to what are the different pathways for permitting an ADU in different scenarios, and what are the implications in terms of the types of development standards that would or would not apply. Because the more you see scenarios, the more difficult it is to kind of parse through. And so there's basically one summary table that deals with all the detached ADU options. That includes both the single family and multifamily provisions, as well as our movable tiny house provisions, as well as all of the attached options, including conversions and junior ADUs. I just had one local kind of implementation issue I wanted to highlight that we've also been working through, which is kind of challenges around power line easements and permitting of ADUs. So this is something that's been evolving here in LA for us, but kind of earlier on in the state law changes, we were seeing all ADU permit applications being referred to our Department of Water and Power for a clearance if it was within 5 to 10 feet of a power line easement. And so that was really affecting about 1 in 5 of all of our permits. I think that's what this chart is showing here, the number that were being referred. And I think the majority were being approved, but it was creating a lot of additional time for review for the applicant. And so we actually worked with them to understand the concerns and have been able to narrow the pool of applications that are being referred. And so now it's only if they are within the power line easement. And I believe they're generally being approved if they are compliant with General Order 95, that's like state PUC standards around like line drops and kind of the distance between the residential structure and the power line. But that is still something that is causing additional time for review for projects. So just something kind of interesting to highlight is there are lots of little issues and things that are coming up in terms of implementation that we're working through here at the local level. But with that, I'll end my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have chatted in. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Callie. And it's so exciting, the movement in City of LA, and for us to share the best practices and how every city to be the next City of LA. So we hope to get to that place. So we have a lot of great questions. I am going to start with Lonnie. So just preparing you. Let me see if I can find you here. I'm gonna go ahead and see if I could, there you go. All right, unmute you. Lonnie, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Well, I can. Hopefully everyone else can as
Okay,
well.
there we go.
Yeah. All right, go ahead and shoot.
Okay, mostly I was just curious as to what percentage of the HOAs have CCNRs that have a limit, a percentage limit of renters versus owners. I know very small ones will often say no more than 50% of the occupants may be renters. And because of Colin saying that renters can often be excluded from the whole HOA process, I'm really curious if we have any kind of statistical information about the limitation of owners versus renters. Does that make sense? That, you know, there, and if we are building ADUs into them, will that now be restricted by the percentage of renters that are allowed in the overall subdivision?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Lonnie. I appreciate you bringing it up. It is something that we hope to be able to look into and research once we get more copies of CCNRs from, you know, throughout each county.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we don't yet have an answer to that. So hopefully we'll get some more resources and be able to answer that, because that is very important when it comes to ADUs and other housing.
Okay, thanks. The other thing was just a piece of information I was offering, that if you want to find out about housing elements and how many of them are starting to include the ADUs, I have several people I know at ABAG who have been tracking the housing elements, so we can connect when we talk on Sunday about people that you can maybe seek information from, because they do track that on a regular basis.
Great.
Okay, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Lonnie. Next, Joe had a question regarding the high severe fire zone. Joe, you are on, or you should be. Let me unmute you. Oh, looks like that's not gonna happen for some reason.
Can you hear me?
Okay, now we can hear you.
Okay, all right. This is Joe Serrano. Thank you for taking the time to have this this presentation. I actually had two questions. The first question didn't go through because there was no send button. At least I didn't see one, and it had to do with the HOA thing. So my experience, I'm a residential designer permit processor, and I do a lot of ADUs in the Bay Area. And what I'm finding is that, and this is besides the HOA conversation, because it really just adds to the issue, which is there is a lot of confusion within the jurisdictions that I work in, including Alameda County, Contra Costa County, San Francisco, and all the different counties in the Bay Area, that they either have their own overlays of state law, which sometimes conflicts with state law, or they just outright ignore it. And it's kind of frustrating to me, because, I'm trying to help my clients with their housing needs, and some of the cities and jurisdictions are just flat out ignoring state law. And I've had conversations with HCD, and I have reported my findings and experience with some of these jurisdictions. And in some cases, HCD has been able to respond and get the cities to comply. But in other instances, they have basically thrown their hands up and said, we can't do anything. And so my question is regarding HOAs, because what I see is just another overlay of bureaucracy. It's almost like it's kind of an artificial creation of jurisdictional regulatory barriers. And so when we have all of these different interpretations of state law within the normal course of pulling a permit in a building jurisdiction that has regulations, codes, and ordinances that are common amongst every jurisdiction that issues building permits, and then we throw in an HOA now on top of that.
Mhm.
It's like that. It's almost like you're looking for the escape route. What's the quickest way of escape to make sure that you can help your clients and create some consistency?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we get the gist of the question, Joe. Thank you so much for that question. And I don't know if you want to just start, Colin.
I definitely heard the comment. What, can you summarize the question?
Well, I guess it's a question for maybe both of you to respond to. It just sounds like there's misalignment with the state level legislation and interpretation on the local level. That's like what my large takeaway was. So and I think he was using HOAs as an example of that. So
I mean, in my experience working in multiple jurisdictions throughout California, I've seen it on the side of the government. It's difficult to keep up with all the new legislation, both at the state level and local levels. So there's certainly a lot of empathy there. And yeah, I mean, in terms of the HOA layer, it is something worth looking into, which is why we're looking into it. But I'd kick it over to Callie.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I don't think I really caught, I mean, I see there's a written question about the fire sprinkler requirement that we have here in LA, but I'm not sure I fully caught what the question was there for us.
yeah, I think it was the overall misinterpretation or interpretations of what's happened from the state level, and I think HOAs was an example of the bureaucracy and conflicting with what's happening in terms of larger policies. But I think that is a good segue to questions about I think just the hillside area. There, I saw a question here about in new development in the hillside area, do they have sprinkler requirements? And that's similar to Jane's question. So I'm gonna go ahead and unmute Jane if she is ready to ask her question. Let's see. Jane, are you there?
No, yes.
Yeah, we hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was wondering, in the early first pieces of legislation, the city of LA was had no appetite for any variances or anything like that from the state standards. Do you think now with that new ordinance and the prohibition in the hills on those places, properties that really are not hillsides, but they're mapped like hillsides, and now you can't do an ADU at all, or a new construction one, do you think there's an appetite for variances, or will they deviate in some way, or are they going to be kind of hard-nosed?
Yeah, so we were really struggling with, I will say, kind of really strike the right balance with addressing a lot of, there are some very kind of serious and legitimate kind of health and safety concerns in some of our hillside neighborhoods that have very substandard streets. And then, with the fact that, yeah, you're kind of alluding to, there are potential hillside areas that are mapped that, there may be no issue with building an ADU there. And so that's why we kind of built in those exceptions that I described. So the idea really is that if you are honest, it's a 20-foot roadway is actually like still below a standard roadway here in LA.
There are none in the hillsides, I don't think, from what I remember. Like
the 20-foot roadway?
Yeah, like zero.
Yeah, and so that is a challenge. So I mean, I think that kind of then gets to the workaround of building something that would comply with our hillside regulations and doing a conversion. That's still something that would be allowed. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. But I would say that one of the weird things about our ADU ordinance is that the way that it's written, there's not an ability to request for a variance or any kind of deviation from the standards that are within the ADU ordinance, because it itself is already sort of a deviation or like an exception from our zoning code to allow it. It's just kind of like a weird way in how it sits in our code. So I think there are other ways to deal with getting, you know, potentially getting around those restrictions. But yeah, the way that it is now, you would not be able to ask for a variance if you were within a hillside area, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess what I would say is we were dealing with also a reality here where the preference was an outright ban among many of the decision makers. And so we were trying to not have that.
Great, thank you. And then we have Cole Peterson asking about the CCNRs. Let me see if I could unmute him here.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Cole.
Hey, so
Oh,
Colin,
yeah, sorry, Cole. Do you, I should have stated this in the beginning, but if you don't mind just stating your affiliation, and then you could ask your question.
sure.
There we
I'm an invader listening in from Oregon here. Colin, question for you about CCNRs. Interested to know whether like detached accessory structures, I've never really studied CCNRs, but are detached accessory structures ever banned outright, and does the state law supersede them? I think there's like so many ways that a CCNR could preclude an ADU, some of which are significant like that, some of which are minor. So I was hoping you could illuminate us on some of those and whether there's been any precedent set so far under the new legislation of CCNRs being challenged. You're muted still. There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. And do want to acknowledge that there's definitely more research to be done, and we would like to be able to answer those types of questions. ZMR, can you repeat the question? Or Cole, do you want to?
Oh, yeah, Cole, you're unmuted.
Yeah, so Colin, the question is, would a detached accessory structure provision with the CCNR be an acceptable form of something that a CCNR could still have, or would that be considered unreasonable under the legislation?
So, and that's the thing, right, is it's up to interpretation, and it'll be interesting to see how it's interpreted and implemented and whether or not there's any sort of litigation or legal challenges of any sort. The part that I wanted to acknowledge was that in some cases, HOAs may be having unintentional consequences of policies that are already in place or that will be in place. You know, for example, the one that I mentioned earlier where it's, you know, needing to rent out the entire lot, for example, as opposed to just a portion of it, that being banned. Some of that is unintentional and wasn't necessarily, you know, looking forward to the potential of a garage conversion becoming an ADU, for example. But the detached structure that you mentioned is worth looking more into. So as we hopefully get more help to be able to look into CCNRs, the ideal would be if we can get you know, thousands, tens of thousands of these things in PDF so that we can have a really good technical person write an algorithm or something like that to be able to search for keywords like the ones that you're mentioning so that we can figure out how widespread that may be.
If I could just briefly say one more thing, that Oregon, you know, we also, I think there's more likely to be more HOAs in California than Oregon, but Oregon's legislation said that ADUs would not be precluded from new HOAs, but pre-existing HOAs they could disallow ADUs indefinitely. So that was just a different tack that Oregon ended up taking on this question.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Cole, for the question. we're near time, but I did want to get to two more folks. I see, Louis, that you have your hand raised, but I know Raphael's been holding his question for a little bit. So Raphael, if you could just state your affiliation and then ask away. How about now? Sounds like we're having technical issues with you.
No,
Oh,
got it.
there you
Yeah.
go. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
I'm Raphael, ADU builder from Orange County. I have a question for Colin. I have a project in Tustin, which is under HOA administration. We just pulled the permits with the county. And my question is there any tip to submit the project to HOA or any specific application? Because my customer wants to use the ADU as a guest house, not for rentals. And should I mention that? Is that better do that?
Right. So I would recommend working with the property owner to locate the deed and all the different title documents that are included in the package, which would include the codes, covenants, and restrictions, and bylaws and articles of incorporation related to the HOAs. And then within the CCNRs, seeing whether or not that issue is addressed in any way. In a lot of cases, HOAs are banning short-term rentals, if that's what your client may be wanting to do. Local jurisdictions, being cities and counties, also regulate the short-term rental industry, so that's worth looking into as well. As it relates to the design review process that you mentioned, that should also be in the HOA documents, but as I mentioned earlier, depending on the HOA, they may have a CCNR document that refers to a separate document for architectural and design review that would lay out the process, and then there, maybe on the HOA website, which I've seen in some cases, there is an application to be submitted. And so, you're welcome to reach out to me and we can chat further.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we're pretty much at time. Louis, if you can keep your comment or question to less than a minute, go ahead and you'll have the last word, and then we're going to wrap up.
Hey, yes. Hey, thank you so much. Yes, Louis Morante with California EMB. I promise I'll keep it short. California EMB works on statewide legislation here in Sacramento. I just wanted to flag that we had raised this issue, Colin, of HOAs being able to prevent renters to Assemblymember Ting. He's very interested in pursuing legislation on it. So anyone on this call, Colin especially, should reach out to me. My email is louis@caemb.org. Again, that's louis@caemb.org. Would be happy to reach out to anyone on the call and work together on that particular bill. So thank you for the minute. Sorry.
No, don't apologize. Yeah. Thank you so much. And Louis is also a board member of the Casito Coalition. So with that, there was a couple more questions related to the hillside development and ADUs and an intersection of that with the City of LA's legislation and sprinklers. So I think, Kelly and I and Colin will make sure to address all the outstanding questions that we weren't able to get to at this Q&A. But with that, I just wanted to thank you all for attending, for your participation. Thank you so much. Again, visit casitocoalition.org and continue to follow us. And we do have another webinar pretty much every Friday through May. We have a webinar on Fridays at 3:30. So if you haven't registered for that, please do so. So again, huge thanks to our awesome speakers. Thank you for supporting the Casito Coalition. And with that, have a great weekend. Bye.